The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is Anne Brontë's second and final novel, published in 1848 under her pseudonym Acton Bell. Unlike her first novel, Agnes Grey, 1847, which garnered less immediate attention, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall caused a sensation with its exploration of controversial themes such as adultery, marital separation, alcoholism, and domestic abuse. Initially overshadowed by her more famous sisters, Anne Bronte's reputation experienced a resurgence in the later 20th century, particularly among feminist scholars who praised the novel's themes of gender equality and female independence. Today, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is widely recognized as a classic of English literature. In a letter to J. Hafford, Gilbert Markham, the son of a gentleman farmer, reflects on pivotal events preceding their acquaintance. Around 1827, at the age of 24, Gilbert becomes intrigued when Mrs. Graham, a young single mother, moves into the long-abandoned Wildfell Hall nearby. The local community, including Gilbert's family, is captivated by Mrs. Graham's aloof demeanor and protective attitude toward her son Arthur. Initially drawn by curiosity, Gilbert gradually admires Mrs. Graham's composed nature and independence, as she earns a living through her art in London. His companionship with the more mature Mrs. Graham leads Gilbert to outgrow his shallow infatuation with the rector's daughter, Eliza Millward, even though Mrs. Graham does not encourage his attentions and insists she will not remarry. Gilbert realizes he is in love with Helen Graham when the young people of the neighborhood enjoy a picnic excursion by the sea. Gossip circulates that questions Mrs. Graham's relationship with the local young squire, Frederick Lawrence. Gilbert defends Mrs. Graham from the rumors, which he suspects are being spread by a jealous Eliza and the proud Jane Wilson, who wants to win Mr. Lawrence herself. When Gilbert can no longer hide his feelings for Mrs. Graham, she promises to tell him about her past. Before they speak, Gilbert sees her walking with Lawrence, who puts his arm around her as she leans on him. Gilbert is crushed at this betrayal, and his manner toward both of them turns cold and abrupt. When Lawrence approaches Gilbert one day while they are riding, Gilbert angrily strikes Lawrence, who falls from his horse. Wanting to prove his conclusions about her are wrong, Helen gives Gilbert her journal and asks him to read it, but to not share with anyone what he learns. Gilbert, writing to his friend, says he will relate the contents in whole. Thus begins Helen's journal, dated 1821. Helen is 18 and in love. In her journal, she describes how, on a visit to London with the aunt and uncle with whom she lives, she met and fell in love with the handsome, charming Arthur Huntingdon. Her uncle invites friends to their country home, a party that includes Huntingdon, and Helen is ecstatic. Huntingdon discovers Helen's feelings and teases her by flirting with Annabella Wilmot, but he assures Helen he is in love with her, and Helen's aunt catches them in an embrace. Helen insists she wants to marry Huntingdon despite her aunt's warnings that he is not a man of strong principle. Helen believes she can be a redeeming influence on her husband. Soon after she agrees to marry him, however, Helen learns about aspects of Huntingdon's character that make her doubt his integrity. He pokes fun at his friend, Lord Loughborough, who struggled to overcome addictions to gambling, alcohol, and opium. Once they are married, Helen confides in her journal that she finds Huntingdon selfish, vain, thoughtless, and unkind. He teases her with stories about his previous love affairs and has no real interests of his own. Helen's efforts to chastise and guide him lead to quarrels rather than his reformation. When Helen has a son, her husband complains about her devotion to the boy. Helen loves her husband and feels it is her duty to see to his comfort and care, but the task is increasingly difficult as he becomes capricious, scornful, and mocking towards her. Huntingdon makes trips to London or to other house parties while leaving Helen at home to manage the house and estate. When he invites friends to stay at Grassdale, Helen is insulted to find that her husband still flirts with Annabella, even though she married Lord Loughborough. Huntingdon's other friends, Hattersley and Grimsby, encourage excessive drinking and rowdy behavior, and Helen writes in her journal of violent scenes where a drunk Hattersley strikes and shakes his wife Millicent, Helen's friend. Walter Hargrave, Millicent's brother, tries to ingratiate himself with Helen by reporting on her husband's bad behavior. Helen tries vainly to keep Huntingdon from drinking too much, but he no longer cares for her opinion or her affection. Helen is devastated to learn that Huntingdon is having an affair with Lady Loughborough. When she confronts them, neither shows remorse for their adultery. For Helen, from that day forward, she is a wife in name only. Huntingdon's behavior has destroyed her love for him. He taunts her by showing Helen love letters that Lady Loughborough writes. Helen is aggrieved by the pursuit of Walter Hargrave, who wants her to run away with him and is angry when she refuses. She wishes to remove her son Arthur from his father's increasing alcohol addiction and corrupting influence. Helen's first attempt to leave her husband is thwarted when Huntingdon reads her journal and learns of her plans. When Huntingdon brings in a governess who is really his mistress, Helen takes her son and her loyal servant Rachel to Wildfell Hall, a family property where her brother Frederick has agreed to let her stay. The journal ends with Helen's report of meeting various new neighbors. Gilbert resumes his letters to Hafford, describing his emotional reconciliation with Helen. Now that he understands what she has gone through, he loves her more than ever. Helen insists that they cannot see each other, but might write letters after she leaves. Shortly thereafter, Gilbert is astonished to hear that Helen has returned to her husband to nurse him while he is ill. Helen's letters to Frederick, which he shares with Gilbert, describe how she tries to persuade Huntingdon to repent of his ways, but he dies in agony and fear of going to hell. Then, Helen's uncle dies as well, and Gilbert feels it would be improper to approach her while she is mourning. When Eliza Millward shares a rumor that Helen is to be married, Gilbert rushes off to find that Frederick has married Esther Hargrave, Walter's sister. Gilbert wishes to see Helen, but when he learns she has inherited her uncle's estate, he fears that their situations are too different now, and she would do better to forget him. As Gilbert stands outside the gates of Stanningley, young Arthur notices him, and Helen invites him inside. Gilbert explains that he refrained from contacting her out of pride that she is too far above him in station. Helen insists they are equals in spirit as long as he loves her. Gilbert concludes by dating his letter 1847 and reminding Hafford that he and Helen have had many happy years together, have several healthy children, and look forward to a visit from Hafford and Gilbert's sister, Rose. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe. Thank you.